My personal question in animal protection is, as we become more aware as a movement of people working on behalf of animals, is how are we going to go from a world of rules and consequences to a system where we're acting more cooperatively? So far, a lot of animal protection has been enforcement of law. And this means going after bad actors. To my mind, a lot of animal law is people who harm wild animals, or people who wrongly endanger animals or abuse animals and things of that nature. And as we have a finer and more evolved understanding of carceral logistics, it's the question of who are we going to bring into the sort of under the umbrella of animal protection that we can cooperate with, rather than simply correct, and ultimately creates scenarios where we're impacting more with consequences rather than with greater understanding of why people are engaged in these what we would consider exploitative situations. So what's coming to mind is a lot of the work that I've done with farmers. So I think the general sense is that it's a bad farmer who's doing bad things to animals, and that individual should be punished. When in reality, I think that individual has also been, at least in my experience, a lot of times, especially in the chicken industry where I've worked a great deal in poultry, a lot of those people are victims of the same system. So the exploitative practices and the cost cuttings and efficiencies that impact animals are also impacting those individuals. So creating a scenario where we're cooperating with folks that maybe are part of these systems to ultimately help them bring to bear the problems that are in that system, rather than going after them in a punitive or scolding manner. I think that's the next hill for us to climb.
For animal protection generally, my personal issue is developing a body of case law that recognizes the intrinsic value of wild animals. I do a lot of work in a lot of different areas because I believe in the inherent value of all animals. But it is definitely true that in the same way we treat domesticated and farmed animals as a utilitarian object, we also treat wild animals in this way. And so I am trying to introduce into state wildlife management decisions the notion that recreational, aesthetic, and an animal's own interests are equally paramount to those of the consumptive users, which are hunters, trappers, fishers.
I think that a big issue that we have is sometimes getting caught up in nuance. And we see this in many different aspects of animal law. You might have an organization whose position is just slightly different than another organization's position. Or you might have two organizations that generally agree on a certain policy but get caught up in the details. And unfortunately, animal law is just not at a point where we have the luxury of doing that. We don't have the strength in numbers or the people power to get caught up in nuance in that way. So I think my one big question is, how can we move past that and focus on the larger issues, and how can we come to agreements that allow us to move forward instead of setting us back in this work that's already so challenging?
I work at an organization that has a very broad focus in terms of helping animals in a variety of different ways, whether it's through civil litigation, through legislative advocacy, through criminal justice reform. I think the one issue that's kind of stands out overriding all of these different areas that excites me the most is that there has never been more broader societal awareness about the nexus between how we treat animals and the impacts on human health, the impacts on the environment, whether we're talking about pandemics and pandemic resistance, nutrition, environmental degradation and pollution on both a localized level or on a broader scale. Animals have finally become a part of a conversation that we've all seen so clearly, this nexus for so long, but society really hasn't. And I really think It's where we go from here. If we can continue to normalize that, then all of a sudden an animal protection issue will just be seen in just a fundamentally different way, whether it's by a legislator, by a court. And I think really investing in continuing to normalize that connection, which we've all seen for such a long time, will be the best thing we can do to move forward.
The focus of my work is to get the major food corporations on a global scale to do better. And when it comes to animals, the most important they can do is keep their promises. Most of the major food companies have pledged to stop using eggs from chickens confined in small cages, pork from operations where mother pigs are confined in small cages, to change how broiler chickens are bred so they're not constantly in pain and warehouses stuffed together, offering more plant-based offerings. The pledges are great and they're a wonderful step forward, but implementing those pledges is exactly what's going to help the animals on the ground. So how do we make that happen? I think lawyers can play a tremendous role in terms of ensuring companies have some fiduciary responsibilities to keeping the commitments they've made, not just to the public, but also to shareholders. And so if we just get every food company globally to, even if they don't make any new policies, just actually fulfill their old ones, we're gonna help billions of animals a year. And yes, there's room for advocates to push in a public way. There's room for shareholders to push internally within companies, doing things like shareholder proposals, and also publicly too. But I'm sure there are also legal avenues where there are some issues that when it comes to breaking fiduciary responsibility, these corporations have to be held accountable.
My big question is, it seems to me that we, the more we look into industries, the more we discover that that there are significant concerns with animal welfare occurring with seemingly all of them. And so, examples of that would be, only recently have we started to delve into oceans and fishing and aquaculture, and then we start to look at the science of those animals, sort of how they perceive their lives, how they feel pain, and we discover, oh, it's a lot worse than we previously thought. And so I think sort of a big question is, like, what don't we know about animal industries, or industries that really interact with animals at all? We may be exploiting animals without realizing that we're exploiting them. And so, I think like pathways for sort of solving that or answering that question is really just to develop more programs, like graduate animal programs that outside of sort of advocacy programs that just study various industries, dig into the science on sort of how animals live in the world and interact with humans, and sort of from there, I think we'll discover more advocacy paths towards trying to make their lives better.
My big issue that I care most about is building more power to take on the factory farming industry, because right now the barnyard, as it's known in lobbying circles, which is the massive lobbying force that the factory farming industry wields at all levels of government in the United States, we're far outgunned by them in the animal advocacy movement, and they have better relationships with legislators. They have more sophisticated lobbying outfits. They, of course, have more money to conduct research. And we can do a lot more than we're currently doing now to counter that power. We're never going to have as much money as they're going to have, but we do have some strategic advantages in the sense that we have hundreds of thousands, millions of people that can see that what we're saying, that some common sense things like the need to get animals out of being confined in cages their entire lives, that's common sense and that shouldn't be legal, and that some of the things that we do to cows and chickens and pigs on factory farms would be cause for sending you to jail if they were done to cats and dogs. And so because we have the advantage of morality being on our side, we can harness a lot of grassroots power in our movement in order to get more power in policy circles. And one of the ways that we can do that, one of the things that we need to do that, is by engaging more in the electoral process. Because at the end of the day, even if a politician, if a legislator agrees with you, if they think that taking action on behalf of your issue is going to hurt them at the ballot box, or even if it's just going to not have a positive effect for them at the ballot box, they're going to be that much less likely to take action. So we need to show them that as a movement, we help people get elected that take a stand for animals, that take a stand against factory farming. And that means showing up around election season, knocking on doors for candidates that have proven themselves to be champions for animals, making sure that they stay in office or making sure that they get into office, make sure they rise to higher levels of office.
What I think is a really big issue that's different than some of the other issues we face is industrial aquaculture. And I'll say why. I mean, most of the work with land-based factory farming or animal factories is retroactive. In other words, we have these industries that are ingrained and have already become the dominant paradigm of our food system on land. And, you know, we no longer have the family farms that we used to have a generation ago in Iowa and all these big agricultural states. There are a few states where we're still fighting to keep confined animal feeding operations from taking hold, but that's the minority. Whereas in our ocean waters, particularly in our federal ocean waters, in the 21st century now, we're going to have a battle over what we're going to use that water for. And the industry wants to use it to create fish CAFOs, to create essentially the same model we have for livestock production, but now for fish in the exclusive economic zone in the oceans, the federal waters 300 to 200 miles offshore. And I see so many parallels from all of my years of work on that we can have a chance to prospectively avoid and pick a different future of our food and a future for the oceans there. But you can see the parallels in taking what had been a public space and privatizing it, in displacing communities with corporations in that space, and of course, confining animals in a way that doesn't allow them to have their natural behavior. Fish isn't always the first megafauna that comes up when you think about wildlife or when you think about livestock. I think in the space, more and more it is. Look, salmon is there a more heroic creature than a salmon? We're talking about the fish that's at the top of every native totem in the Pacific Northwest, where I live in Portland, Oregon. Our region, the Pacific Northwest, is defined by how far the salmon can swim. The anadromous journey that they have is 10,000 miles. Now we're going to put them in pens, dump fungicides on them, dump pesticides on them, dump antibiotics on them, and never let them leave those pens until they're slaughtered. So to me, it's this very compelling narrative and arc of species that have this cultural, spiritual, economic resonance for native cultures, for our own country.
In my career, I am driven most by laboratory animal issues. This is for a lot of reasons, but specifically right now, funding trends have turned away donor dollars and interest in laboratory animal issues. It's critical that we keep up this advocacy work, and in my case, this kind of litigation.
I'd say probably the big issue for me is enforcement of the animal laws that we have on the books already, which is not to suggest that there isn't a tremendous amount of room for improving laws for animals. The laws we have aren't ideal, but they are somewhat meaningful. And if they were enforced in a meaningful way, that would have an impact. So I have spent a lot of time both in practice, in teaching, in scholarship, trying to address and navigate the enforcement issue. I think some of the things that we can be doing in that space are thinking about agencies that have dedicated animal protection focuses. So rather than having the U.S. Department of Agriculture, whose primary mandate is to promote American agriculture, including animal agriculture, responsible for our key federal animal protection laws, having an animal protection agency responsible for that, just like we created an environmental protection agency and centralized the environmental laws under that agency.
How can we get society at multiple levels to apply its principles of ethics and justice that we already know how to apply and understand for humans to animals. And how do we do that in a way that acknowledges their interests, or at least in a way that doesn't deprive them of everything that they've been evolved to do and essentially take away hope, obviously impose suffering, cruelty, death on them. If we were to be successful at this, it would mean that many major industries would have to end or at least become unrecognizable. And I think people intuitively understand this, and that's where the pushback comes in. But the good news is, I don't think this is a fundamental difference of values. I think most people do care about animals. They do not want to see them being cruelly treated. I think our job is to do 4 things. Increase the understanding of just how cruel and how pervasive the cruelty is in these industries. People don't get it. They don't understand that it really is that bad. And I think when they do get that education and when it sinks in, it's very powerful. And people really feel engaged with the issue and they feel inspired to take action. 2, we need to create law that recognizes and values animals that can be used to stop these industries from operating in the way that they are, in an essential way. 3, we need to give every person a clear understanding of something that they can do right now. Not every person can or feels like they can get up and dismantle an entire industry or change the law or whatever major big systemic thing that has to be done, but everyone can go vegan. And if people feel in an immediate sense that they can't go vegan right now, you get them started on the first step in that direction and you kind of keep going forward in that direction. But the point is, everybody has to feel like there is some action they can take to make themselves feel like they are part of this and that they will be able to make a change if they do something about it. And finally, I think we need to create a cohesive narrative. People are operating under competing narratives. They're understanding the world through competing narratives that are either incompatible with the reality of how bad this is, or they're incomplete. And we need to understand what those narratives are so that we can understand how to create our own and to get that out into the world. And I think if we were able to do that, we would be more effective at the other 3 components of this as well.
I think a lot of animal work and animal advocacy is based in the notion of convincing people to do the right thing, and that almost never works globally. People have been doing horrible things to themselves and animals for as long as there have been people. So the question is, in my opinion, not to change people's minds so much as to direct the work towards incremental steps forward.
The big issue that we're focused on is the intersection of animals and climate change, which takes is manifold in its forms. And so first and foremost, how animal agriculture is driving climate change, and that we know that dealing with just oil and gas companies and transport is inadequate to stop catastrophic warming, and that the food system alone, even if all of those things were solved immediately, would put us on course to make it impossible that we would meet international climate targets. And so I think that's vital in and of itself for people, but also because this changing planet is going to have extraordinarily negative effects on animals that we're only beginning to understand and conceive of, that take such a variety of form. It's astonishing. So that's the issue. I think it's a very exciting issue in terms of achieving tangible progress in the next decade for animals, and particularly for farm animals, because the resources that are available and the sort of societal sentiment and political will focused on climate change is in many ways far more pervasive and advanced than with animal welfare alone. So I think it's an opportunity where there's a tremendous amount of synergy and excitement that will both, hopefully address climate as both a existential, really, I was going to say ecological, but existential, ecological, and welfare issue, but also potentially bring much greater resources to this movement than if it were tackled just by animal welfare advocates and groups alone.